Hello and welcome to the Provisioning Manager video series. My name is Tom Bammert from Acadian Labs. So we're going to continue talking about configuring Provisioning Manager. And particularly today, we're going to talk about global variables. So the first thing I need to describe is what are global variables? And the best way for me to do that is actually to take you into one of the applications where global variables will be used to provision and give you a demonstration of where they can be used. The best place I can give you an example of global variables usage is in Cisco Communications Manager, Unified Communications Manager. So what I want to do is actually, I'm looking at some devices for a particular user. And this user's name is Bobby Draper. So if we look at, for instance, the CSF device for this user, when you're provisioning in Communications Manager, if you're familiar with the process, it's very repetitive. And by that I mean the amount of times you need to enter the same data is extremely repetitive. So this is where global variables come into play. Basically, they are a variable that captures information and places it with only one-time input into many locations within the applications. So for example, let's look at this CSF device. And you can see that for one, the username, bdraper, right, is used in many different places. Even if it's in combination with other data, global variables can help cut this down. But more so, what about first name, last name? Anybody who's familiar with provisioning, in most organizations, you are typing first name and last name over and over for various fields. And it's not, or nothing is more evident than when you get to line. So if we click on the line for this user, you can see description, alerting name, ASCII alerting name, you name it. And if we scroll down here to the bottom, again, first name, last name, again, first name, last name for caller ID. So it is extremely repetitive. And the goal here is to create something that can capture that data one time and use it throughout all of the devices for this user. Because notice, I just showed you one. If we look at the TCT device or the bot device or the phone, it's going to be the same thing. So that's really the purpose of global variables. So now that you understand what global variables are, let's talk about the three types of global variables that Provisioning Manager currently offers. One is we have default. These are the standard global variables that are probably going to be most commonly used to capture data for input fields. So that would be something like first name or last name, as I demonstrated in Communications Manager. Then we have list. And list is quite useful in the event that you have a set of data, such as maybe office location, that you don't want your provisioners to type in every time. You'd like them to select from a drop-down list because we all know what happens. Ultimately, people type things in different ways. There could be spelling mistakes, whatever it might be. And you might be using this data to, basically sort or locate users. So it's important that it's right and it's the same way every time. The last type we have is system. And this is really something that's only created once. And system global variables are used to use data that doesn't exist yet in your provision to actually be put into specific fields. So let me give you an example. It's a little bit hard to explain, but let's say that you were using our system to generate a telephone number for a user, but you actually want to use that telephone number in a field somewhere. So the new DN for a new user, let's say, gets put in the line description field. Okay. Now, unfortunately, it's kind of the cart before the horse under normal circumstances. But with system GVs, you can actually achieve that goal. And we'll cover this more later, so don't think you have to remember this all now. As we go through and create it, it will become much, much clearer. Okay, so with that said, what do you need to get started with for global variables? And it's very simple. You need a plan, right? And you can absolutely watch this video to help, drive ideas as to what you're going to need. But you do need to go through your current provisioning process or the ultimate provisioning process that you want. Look at the different applications that you're using, just like we did a few moments ago in Communications Manager, and say, when I provision a user, what data am I typing in? right? What data is specific to creating that user? Am I using first name, last name? Am I using, as I mentioned before, office location in my description field? What other things am I doing? And those are going to drive your list of global variables. So it's very, very important that you have this planned out when you actually go to create those. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started configuring global variables. To configure global variables, you can actually do this as either A, the PME admin user, or B, as an administrator within the system, anyone who has access to the system menu. Considering if you've watched the previous videos, we've already created an admin user, which is myself. We're going to go ahead and log in as an admin user, which will make it easier to see some of the other components in the system. So I'm logged in, and the first thing I need to do to get to global variables is expand the system menu. So if I go down almost to the bottom, you're going to see the global variables. And as I mentioned, global variables are incredibly useful on eliminating the amount of input you have or input you have to type in order to provision a user. So the other important thing to mention is they are global. And when I say global, they are global to the system. So as you may be in a multi-cluster environment, you do not need to create these for every single service group. These are cross service groups across the entire system. So it's also important that you make them as global as possible, right? Because they will show up for every cluster that you have. So I'm going to go ahead and click add. And as I mentioned, there are three types: default, list, and system. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a default. What I like to start with is a very, very simple one. So I know in my environment that first name and last name are always used. So I'm going to go ahead and create first name as my variable name. And variable name is what will show up to the end user that's using this global variable. And really for tooltip, it's pretty self-explanatory. You can put first name. So when they are hovering over this, that's what they'll see. And that is optional, by the way. And description, I'm going to keep it the same. This is internal to Provisioning Manager. The users do not see this. Now the question is whether or not you want to make that optional. And by default, global variables are required at provision time, which means that if someone does not fill in the box for first name, they will not be able to perform a provision. So if this is something that, maybe it's not totally required, make sure you check it off as optional. Otherwise, they will not be able to process the provision. So I'm going to leave mine as required because I absolutely, when people are using a job that has first name, want them to fill it in. The next thing is input validation. So we have a couple options here. One is you can choose from our list of input validations, and this will basically force the person that's inputting data into that box to adhere to these standards. So obviously for first name, I'm not going to pick something like date or numeric unless my names happen to be all digits. But standard text is a pretty safe bet. And the nice thing about standard text is it can be pretty much anything. It can include numbers. It can include, obviously, text. Now we get to appearance index. And you might be wondering, what is appearance index? Well, this is very simple. Global variables will always appear first on the provision page. We wanted to give you the ability to put them in some logical order. Otherwise, they're going to be in alphabetical order. So what I always like to do is say, okay, where do I want this? And first name, I'm going to go ahead and put as number 1. There's top and number 1, and I'll get to what top is in a second. Top means it's going to go on top no matter what. So I'm going to pick number 1. And I will mention that if you put multiple global variables at the same appearance index, they'll just be ordered in alphabetical order. So it's not going to be the end of the world if you do that. If I want to use a more advanced validation mechanism, I can write my own customer regular expression. So if you have a more complex input validation, that's what will apply here as opposed to this input validation up here. Standard text is completely fine for me. I have no reason. I'm not going to get into doing regular expressions at this point. You can also have a regex fail message as well. If someone does not adhere to it, you can give them some instructions on what to do. So this next piece, this is going to be dependent upon whether or not you are using an LDAP integrated communications manager. This is optional, but it's very, very useful. So I'll give you an example. Let's say that I am using an LDAP integrated communications manager. And in that case, we know that the user ID is already, or the user, I should say, has already been imported into Communications Manager before I can provision. And certain data is already there, like the first name, like the last name, the user ID, maybe some other things like the mail ID and the telephone number. And aside from that, they're kind of like an empty shell, right? But I can leverage that data. So what I want to do is I do want to enable a lookup, and I want to map it to the CUCM end user field, right? And what that's going to do is I'm going to say, find this end user that I'm using in my provision, and then I would like you to get me the first name, okay? So that is going to basically, what you'll see at provision is that is going to allow you to pull that data as opposed to typing that data. So it's pretty cool. If you didn't want to use this, you could uncheck this. You could leave a section blank. And then essentially what's going to happen is someone is going to be prompted to type in the user's first name. But for this example, I would like to enable this validation piece just to show you the power of doing so. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Now, I'm basically at this page where I've just created my first name field. I'm going to create a few more for this demonstration that we'll then use in provisioning. And the second thing I'm going to create is last name. So one of the things I can do to speed the process up is up top, I can hit copy. And here I can just go in and put in last name. Okay. So I now have last name, and then I can just basically copy and paste that down to the rest. The next thing I need to change is down here. I need to change this to last name for my lookup. And I can go ahead now and save this off. Now notice one of the things I did not do was I do want this to be an appearance index 2 as well, and save that. So just make sure if you're copying, you kind of catch that as well to make sure they're in the right order. Now, I need to create the most important thing. And again, I can copy this. So I'm going to copy this again, is I need to create my user ID. All right, this is extremely important usually in any provision. If you're going to be onboarding new users, you're typically going to be using the user ID somewhere. And in my case, I'm going to demonstrate this in an LDAP integrated CUCM environment as well as a Unity connection environment. So this is going to be extremely important. The difference here from my appearance index is I want this to be on top. The first thing I want them to do is select the username, and you're going to see why. So then I need to come down here and I'm going to say end user, just as I did before, and I'm going to say user ID, okay? This enable product type prefix we will cover in another video segment. It's not necessary, it's not required, it's just another feature that we have in here for when you're doing things like name change. So at this point, I'm ready to go ahead and hit save. But I do want to give you guys really a example of all three types. So the next thing I'm going to move from is I created 3 default variables, which will be very useful. I also want to create a list variable. So I'm going to click on add instead of copy, and I'm going to change this to list. And I'm going to call this location. Okay. So I could also, if I want to get more specific, let's just call it office location. And I'm going to, I might, again, this might be a situation where you want to make this optional. It's up to you. I'm going to require this where it's used. And I'm going to come in here and put in my values. So there's 2 types of things you can do. I can put in the same thing twice. So let's just say I put in Boston and then I tab over and I put in Boston. Okay. What that's going to do is the value that's actually going to be provisioned is Boston. The display name that's going to display the user is Boston. The reason we have this is, let's say that you had friendly names, but let's say instead of Boston, I use like site codes, right? So maybe it's like B1267, right? I have a site code that is not friendly at all to the user, but nonetheless, it's what I actually need to be provisioned. So instead, they can actually choose the Boston office, and then it'll populate the right value. In my case, I don't have that, so I'm not going to use that. And then I'll just put in, New York as my second one, New York, right? And then maybe we'll do Atlanta. And I can copy that over. And I could go down, and I could also, by the way, copy and paste from Excel. So I'm going to stop there. I also, if I wanted to, I want to point out you can enable type in data, and that's useful where you give a list, but God forbid something's not there. you can allow them to type it in. So if you want to give them that flexibility, it's not that critical to the point where you're allowing them to actually put something in custom, you can absolutely do that. In my case, I'm just going to leave it as locked down, if I want to call it that, and not allow them to type anything in. Okay, so that's done. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add the last type of global variable, which is system. And system is, right now we only support one type of system global variable. We built this to eventually add in more and more. But this is very, very useful. And right now what we support is directory number. So I actually have that in my cache. So I'm going to go ahead and select that, right? And the global variable name is, again, what's going to show up when the user goes to select the global variable. But the end user or the provisioner will never actually see this. This is all going to be magic that happens behind the scenes. Then we have directory number system global variable instances, meaning how many instances of this would you like to create? I'm going to go ahead and put in 5. And this is an important number. You can change this number later, but this is the number of, let's say, lines that maybe I want to be able to use within a provision. Most cases, to be honest with you, you're probably only going to use 1 or 2. It just would be very complicated to use anymore. So don't get too overwhelmed by this. If you put in 5, it's going to be pretty safe. It's not going to hurt anything. And then we're going to enable system global variables, right? Until I check this box, it's not going to come on. This is actually service group based. So you can select, if you don't want to display this to service group, you can prevent that from happening. Just don't add it here. By default, all your service groups will show up. And we'll go ahead and hit save. Okay, so that's done. So now let's look at our work. So first of all, one, you'll see that those global variables were all created. And I'm going to show you how to use these global variables down the road in another video when we get into actually creating templates and jobs. But right now, just note that they're there and they're ready to be used. So we've got our directory number global variable, our first name, last name, office location, and user ID. So we are now prepared, if this in this case matches everything that we need from an input perspective, we are now prepared to move on to building templates and jobs, which we're going to cover in our upcoming videos. So this completes the process of building out global variables. Thank you very much.